At 8 a.m. on the 1st of November 1920, a death bell began to toll above Mountjoy prison as two executioners entered the cell of a young man named Kevin Barry and led him towards the scaffold. Outside the prison gates, where hundreds of people had gathered since the early hours of the morning, some fell silent while others continued to kneel and recite the rosary, and all hope of a last-minute reprieve faded away with each sickening toll of the bell. A British armoured car slowly forced its way through the mournful crowd and, on coming to a stop, trained its guns on a group of women who led the vigil. The women ignored the mocking whistles of the soldiers and continued to pray on the street. That first terrible ring of the bell could not compare to the void of silence that followed when it ceased. The sentence was complete. 18-year-old Kevin Gerard Barry was dead. Men and women knelt and cried together in the crowd on North Circular Road that now numbered in its thousands as they waited for confirmation from the prison chaplain, who soon appeared at the gate, and the crowd rushed forward. Visibly shaking and with tears rolling down his face, he uttered the words, "It is all over." The execution of Kevin Barry took place just weeks after a failed ambush of a British military vehicle carried out by H Company of the 1st Dublin Brigade of the Irish Republican Army on Church Street that resulted in his capture. The action was part of the Irish War of Independence that had begun 1 year earlier and had become increasingly bloody with the arrival of an auxiliary police force and a despised unit of ex-British soldiers known as the Black and Tans. Volunteers such as Kevin Barry and his comrades in the Irish Republican Army were determined to liberate the island from the grasp of the British Empire and were willing to sacrifice their lives to do so. During his imprisonment, Barry was interrogated and tortured, but he remained steadfast, refusing to give up any names of his fellow volunteers, and he faced his execution without a flinch. On that day, Kevin Barry became the first man to be executed for revolutionary activity since the leaders of the 1916 Rising were shot in Kilmainham Jail 4 years earlier. The photograph of Kevin that is still as recognisable today as it was over 100 years ago shows a teenage boy in a school sports jersey and was printed in newspapers around the world. Taken in Belvedere College a few years before his death, he looks young, happy and carefree, but in truth he was less a boy and more a man with an unshakable commitment to the cause of Irish liberation. His execution was intended to be a warning to his comrades, but instead created a martyr for the cause that would never be forgotten. Join me as I retrace the life of Kevin Gerard Barry from his birth in Dublin's Temple Bar, his early years in Carlow, his schooling and brief college life in Dublin, and the story of how he became a volunteer, fought in the War of Independence, and was executed by the British authorities. Please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the next upload. These videos take weeks to research, film, narrate and edit, so I would greatly appreciate if you would consider sharing the video with a friend or family member who you think might enjoy the story. Kevin Barry was born into a growing family on Monday the 20th of January 1902 in number 8 Fleet Street in Dublin's Temple Bar. The Barrys had lived in the house on Fleet Street for about 10 years as Kevin's parents, Thomas and Mary, sought to expand their successful dairy business with the help of Thomas's sister Judith. The house was leased by the family from Dublin Corporation and was in a perfect city centre location to supply residents of the city with fresh milk from their family farm in Carlow. In a city blighted by cramped tenement housing, Fleet Street mostly consisted of first-class homes occupied by single families, such as William Kerwin, a 28-year-old cabinet maker, and his mother Kate, who lived next door in number 9, and James and Mary Burke and their family, who lived on the other side in number 7. However, numbers 2 and 3, next to a public house near the corner of Bedford Row, were both home to 7 and 8 separate families, as were a few other dwellings on the street. Kevin's father, Thomas Barry, had inherited a substantial dairy farm in Tom Bay, County Carlow, a few miles outside the village of Rathvilly. Here Thomas met Mary Dowling, who lived nearby, and the couple married in St Andrew's Church on Weston Row in 1895. With the help of Tom's sister Judith, the family had established a substantial dairy yard in Pimlico before setting up home on Fleet Street, where they opened a dairy on the ground floor of the house. In addition to their farm in Tom Bay, they also grazed cattle in various places around South Dublin, such as Temple Oak and the Long Mile Road. Dairies were a common sight in the city at the time and provided an essential supply of fresh milk to the residents of Dublin. The 1901 census records the Barry family at number 8 Fleet Street, the year before Kevin's birth. Present in the home are Tom and Mary with their 3 children, Michael, Kathy and Julia, along with Aunt Judith and 2 servants named Kate Kinsella and Mary Muckley. Kate Kinsella, although listed as a servant, was also a trusted friend who would stay with the family for many years. In January 1902, Kevin Barry became the family's 4th child and was baptised in St Andrew's Church the day after his birth. His birth certificate shows that the event was registered by Kate Kinsella in February, who, unable to read or write, signed the form with an X and had been present at the birth. The Barry family would be complete by 1906, with the addition of Kevin's younger sisters, Eileen, Mary and Margaret. The farm and dairy business provided the family with a healthy income, and soon it was time for Kevin to begin his schooling. Along with his siblings, he first attended a large school of 700 students on Clarendon Street, run by the Sisters of the Holy Faith. The building no longer exists, but stood on the site that is now occupied by the Westbury Hotel. Life was about to change dramatically for young Kevin when, in 1908, his father suddenly fell ill. The family could afford one of the best doctors money could buy, Sir Christopher Nixon, who also included the Lord Lieutenant on his patient list. But despite this, Thomas Barry died of heart disease in 1908, leaving behind 36-year-old Mary, a 6-year-old Kevin Barry, and 6 other children. Luckily, Mary had the support of Judith and Kate Kinsella, but she soon decided that the family should return to their roots in Tom Bay. The dairy yard in Pimlico was sold, and Mary moved to Tom Bay with the younger children, while Judith took over the running of the home and business in Fleet Street, and some of the older children remained in Dublin. 6-year-old Kevin already felt at home in Tom Bay, as the family had made frequent trips there to escape the city. The townland is a peaceful rural idyll where the skies are filled with birdsong and the sounds of the trickling waters of the River Derreen as it winds through the fields of unending shades of green. About 5 miles from Tom Bay is the small village of Rathvilly, where Kevin attended the local national school run by headmaster Ned Poole, travelling to the village by horse and cart. By all accounts, Kevin was an affable and mannerly boy who was popular with his classmates and everyone that he met. In a newspaper article, one of his classmates named Nancy Toole, who was the headmaster's daughter, recounted a story of how Kevin and his friend had splashed her hair with water as she carried a bucket from the well to her home. The only time I can think of Kevin showing any signs of devilment was when he drenched my plaits with water one day. I used to carry buckets of water from the well to our home, and one day I met Kevin with a pal as I was going along with 2 buckets full to the brim. The pair of them dipped their hands in the water and splashed it all over my long pigtails until my hair was soaked. I did not tell my father how my hair got wet, and I had to make up some story to keep Kevin out of trouble. Kevin completed his primary school education in Rathvilly, and, aged 13, it was decided that he should return to Dublin to live in Fleet Street once again, so he could attend secondary school. Initially, he enrolled in O'Connell Secondary School on North Circular Road, run by the Christian Brothers, but he was soon to make the move to the private school of St Mary's in Rathmines. This came at a significant expense to the family, but his older sister Kathy and Aunt Judith were particularly eager for him to find success in life. Kevin didn't get to spend long in St Mary's as it closed in 1916 for a period of 10 years, and he once again moved back across the Liffey to an equally impressive institution of Belvedere College on Great Denmark Street, another fee-paying school run by the Jesuit order and the former school of one James Joyce. Belvedere may seem like an unlikely place to produce a Republican such as Kevin Barry, as its students were more likely to become officers in the British Army, but it also counted in its student body Cottle Brua and Joseph Plunkett. In his school essays, it seemed that he was allowed to express his personal political beliefs, and he frequently wrote of social justice, revolution, his disdain for despotic monarchy, and his support for the striking workers of the lockout and James Larkin. Kevin performed moderately well in Belvedere College and managed to secure a scholarship to attend University College Dublin to study medicine, where he began his studies in October 1919. He took full advantage of the opportunities that college life provided him with, and you were just as likely to encounter Kevin Barry enjoying himself at a dance hall, pub or cinema as you were to find him at one of his lectures. As busy as he was in secondary school and university with his studies and social life, Kevin Barry had a secret, for since his second year at Belvedere College, he had been an active member of the Irish Volunteers. To understand how he became so involved in and dedicated to the Republican movement, we need to go back to his early teenage years when, at age 13, he asked his mother if he could join Fianna Éireann, a youth organisation similar to the Scouts, but with a strongly nationalist influence and links to the Irish Republican Brotherhood that was run by Countess Constance Markievicz. Kevin's mother refused to allow him to join the group due to his young age, however he may have done so anyway without her knowledge. Kevin would have been very familiar with the history of the many rebellions against the Crown that had taken place over the centuries, having listened intently to the stories of Wolfe Tone and Robert Emmet. In his brief stint at O'Connell schools, he met Frank Flood, and the two became firm friends. Flood also became an active member of the Volunteers, and was destined to meet the same sad fate as Kevin Barry, along with 8 other volunteers in Mountjoy prison. While Kevin and his family undoubtedly held nationalist views prior to the War of Independence, there were several key moments in his life that led to his decision to take up arms and join the fight against the might of the British Empire. His older sister Kathy, who later would become a member of Cumann na mBan and assist the volunteers during the war, had an interest in the Home Rule movement prior to 1916, which advocated for an Irish Parliament in Dublin while the country would remain part of Great Britain. In a witness statement given to the Bureau of Military History, she described a talk that both she and Kevin attended on the Manchester Martyrs that changed both of their lives. The Manchester Martyrs were three members of the Irish Republican Brotherhood named William Philip Allen, Michael Larkin and Michael O'Brien, who were hanged in 1867 following an ambush on a police van that was carrying two senior members of the Brotherhood. Kevin and I were the two in the family who were Republicans before 1916. I had always been interested in politics, and I followed the Home Rule movement in newspapers and at meetings since I was about 12. I was present at the Great Home Rule meeting on O'Connell Street in 1912, at which Pearse spoke. Shoals of young men I knew were volunteering for the British Army in 1914. I was brought up against reality in the Grafton Picture House when I found it impossible to stand for God Save the King during a performance. My first knowledge of any Irish movement other than Home Rule came with the announcement of the arrest of Ernest Blythe for anti-recruiting activities. My brother Kevin was in school at St Mary's Rathmines, and in November 1915 he bought tickets for himself and myself for the Manchester Martyrs commemoration in the Mansion House. Owen McNeill presided. Bulmer Hobson gave a fiery speech. We felt then that we had found our proper atmosphere. From then on, we were always discovering people among our friends who had the same ideas. Cathy also spoke of the influence Kate Kinsella had on the children as they were growing up. I should mention that we had an old servant called Kate Kinsella, a Dublin woman born in Cork Street. She was born in 1853, came to work for my father and Aunt Judith in 1879, and stayed with us until she died in 1937. Her mother had seen O'Connell released from Kilmainham. She always said that she herself had seen John Devoy escaping in Cork Street from roof to roof after the rising in Tala. She was a friend of Tim Kelly, who was one of the three men hanged for the Park murders, and she knew the other two. Her father was a great personal friend of Skin the Goat. Up to 1916, she had little use for physical force movements because they had let Skin the Goat die in the Union. She was illiterate but had a brilliant mind and memory. The Easter Rising of 1916, a large-scale armed rebellion fought by the Volunteers and the Irish Citizen Army against the British Army, and the subsequent executions of its leaders, had a huge impact on the entire Barry family. In the words of Cathy Barry, from 1916, the way was clear. As a family, we were in full sympathy with the movement and gave every help that came our way, such as contributing to the collections, selling flags, and keeping things for people. Cathy was at home on Fleet Street when the fighting broke out and described the scene as follows. When the firing started on Easter Monday, Kate Kinsella went out into the street to see what information she could gather. She dashed past me and lit 2 candles on her little altar. I said, "What are the candles for, Kate?" She replied, "For the boys that took the castle." And from that on until her last breath, she was an uncompromising Republican. In October the following year, 15-year-old Kevin Barry, while still a student in Belvedere College, enlisted in C Company of the 1st Battalion Dublin Brigade of the Irish Volunteers. Later he would be reassigned to H Company and was also sworn in as a member of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. Cathy Barry wished to join Cumann na Man as soon as possible, but was delayed due to her responsibilities in Fleet Street and Tombay as the oldest child in the family. She did join in 1920 as fighting in the War of Independence intensified, and her duties included hiding and transporting weapons and money, and relaying messages for the volunteers. She often shared a train carriage from Baltinglass to Dublin with a black and tan or two, while carrying a revolver and ammunition under her skirt. Kevin's older brother Michael joined the 3rd Battalion Carlow Brigade of the Volunteers in 1917, becoming adjutant, and his sister Sheila joined Cumann na Man, also in Carlow, and according to Cathy, she was up to her neck in any volunteer activity that took place there. As a young member of the volunteers, Kevin attended training parades each week, and he was soon promoted to the role of Mobilization officer. Training took place early on Sunday mornings, and the location frequently changed to avoid detection by the authorities. Each Saturday afternoon, Kevin left Fleet Street on his bike, having attended school in the morning, followed by a rugby or a hurling match. He carried with him flyers with the details of the following morning's training session, and it was his job to deliver them to volunteers in Dublin city centre and anywhere from Finglas to Rathgar. This took him all day to complete, and according to Kathy, he didn't return to Fleet Street until around 11 p.m. Having cycled around the city for hours, he then had to be ready to attend the parade himself at 8 a.m. the next morning. Kathy later found out that the tiring job of Mobilization officer had been given to Kevin to test his commitment to the movement, as his Belvedere College cap that he wore to training caused quite a lot of amusement among the organisers, some of whom didn't think that he would last very long. He proved himself to be fully committed to the role, and within a short time he was promoted to section commander. Kevin was eager to do more than just train with the volunteers, and he put himself forward for active operations. While on his school holidays, he often returned to Tom Bay, where he temporarily transferred to the Carlow brigade. On one occasion, he was involved in a plan to burn down a house that was going to be used as a barracks by the Crown Forces in Ockavana. 14 volunteers, including Kevin and his brother Michael, set out from Rathvilly and cycled to Ockavana. On reaching the house, they found it to be occupied by William Redmond, MP for Waterford. Following some tense negotiations, Redmond promised the volunteers that he would never allow the British to occupy the building, and the house was spared. One of the biggest issues facing the volunteers was their ability to acquire sufficient numbers of weapons and ammunition to fight against the better armed forces of the RIC, auxiliaries and Black and Tans. To acquire weapons, frequent raids were carried out on police barracks and military transports, and the most significant raid Kevin Barry participated in before the ambush on Church Street was at King's Inns on the 1st of June 1920. King's Inns on Constitution Hill had been under IRA surveillance for some time in the summer of 1920. The building was occupied by the British Army and was used as a base and weapons store. It had been noticed with interest that the soldiers were not particularly diligent in their guard duties and did not seem to feel any sense of threat from potential attack. A plan was devised to raid the base, taking the soldiers by surprise and to relieve them of their weapons and ammunition. On the 1st of June 1920, as the soldiers were entertaining their girlfriends on the green and enjoying the fine weather, they suddenly found themselves surrounded by a group of hand-picked armed men from different companies of the Dublin Brigade, including one Kevin Barry. The soldiers were quickly disarmed, and within a space of 6 minutes, the volunteers walked out of King's Inns with as many weapons as they could carry. As they were about to leave, Dinny Holmes turned to see Kevin emerging from the door with a broad smile on his face and a Lewis machine gun cradled in his arms, as he excitedly exclaimed, "Look, Dinny, look what I got." The operation was a success and a humiliating wake-up call for the British Army. A few months later, a similar opportunity was spotted a short distance away at a bakery on Church Street. A British military lorry carrying armed soldiers was observed pulling up outside Monk's Bakery, close to where Kevin Barry House flats now stand. Again, the soldiers did not seem particularly anxious. Some of them even sat down for a cigarette while they waited for the lorry to be loaded with provisions from the bakery. Once again, the plan was to surprise the soldiers, quickly disarm them, take their rifles, and then disappear into the crowds. Again, the success of the plan relied heavily on no shots being fired, as to do so would draw the attention of the soldiers of the Lancashire Fusiliers stationed nearby in the North Dublin Union. Following the success of the King's Inns raid, Kevin Barry no doubt felt confident that the ambush would be a success. In June, he had missed an examination, and he had another one scheduled on the afternoon of the 20th of September. The ambush was planned to take place in the morning, and the ever-industrious young man calculated that he could take part in the operation and make it back to the examination hall on Earlsford Terrace before 2 p.m. On September 20th, a lorry full of soldiers of the Duke of Wellington Regiment pulled up outside Monk's Bakery as usual. The volunteers, led by Captain Seamus Kavanagh and numbering 24, had already taken up their positions and were trying to blend in with the crowd. When the lorry pulled up outside the gates, 2 of their company entered the bakery to announce their arrival. Before they had time to react, the soldiers that remained in the back of the lorry found themselves held at gunpoint by a group of volunteers, including Kevin Barry. They complied with the orders shouted at them to lay down their weapons, and several volunteers entered the bakery to cut the phone lines. Unbeknownst to the volunteers, one soldier had remained seated on a biscuit box in the back of the lorry and was obscured by view by the soldiers who now stood near the rear of the vehicle. He raised his rifle and began to shoot. For the next few minutes, a brief but vicious firefight broke out on Church Street as the soldiers grabbed their guns and the IRA returned fire. Private Washington dropped dead in the lorry and 2 other soldiers were injured. Several volunteers were injured and, in the frenzy, Kevin's automatic Mauser pistol jammed. Now unarmed, he jumped for cover under the lorry and desperately tried to unjam his weapon. The shooting stopped as quickly as it had begun. The mission had failed and the volunteers dispersed into the crowd, and Kevin Barry found himself alone underneath the lorry and surrounded by English soldiers. Reinforcements from the Lancashire Fusiliers quickly arrived on the scene and helped the injured men into the lorry and prepared to leave the scene. It seemed to Kevin that he still had a chance to escape unnoticed as the lorry pulled away, but fate was not on his side that day, as an elderly woman named Mrs. Garrett, who was sitting on the roadside, yelled out to the soldiers as she feared they were about to run over a boy who had crawled under the vehicle. Kevin Barry was captured. The soldiers threw him onto the floor of the lorry next to the body of Private Washington, and in the few minutes it took them to drive around the corner to the North Dublin Union, he was kicked and prodded with the bayonets of the enraged men. A few moments later, Kevin Barry was subjected to a violent interrogation in the barracks of the Lancashire Fusiliers at the North Dublin Union. He later recounted the details of his torture in a sworn affidavit as follows. On the 20th of September 1920, I was arrested in Upper Church Street in the city of Dublin by a sergeant of the 2nd Duke of Wellington's regiment and was brought under escort to the North Dublin Union, now occupied by the military. I was brought into the guard room and searched. I was then removed to the defaulters' room by an escort with the Sergeant Major. The latter and the escort belonged to the 1st Lancashire Fusiliers. I was then handcuffed. About a quarter of an hour after I was placed in the defaulters' room, 2 commissioned officers came in. They were accompanied by 3 sergeants. A military policeman who had been in the room since I entered remained. One of the officers asked my name, which I gave. He then asked for the names of my companions in the raid or attack. I refused to give them. He then sent the sergeant out of the room for a bayonet. When it was brought in, the sergeant was ordered by the same officer to point the bayonet at my stomach. The same questions as to the names and addresses of my companions were repeated, with the same result. The sergeant was then asked to turn my face to the wall and point the bayonet at my back. The sergeant then said that he would run the bayonet into me if I did not tell. The bayonet was then removed and I was turned around again. The same officer then said to me that if I persisted in my attitude, that he would turn me out to the men in the barrack square, and he supposed I knew what that meant with the men in their present temper. I said nothing. He ordered the sergeant to put me face down on the floor and twist my arm. I was pushed down on the floor after my handcuffs were removed by the sergeant who went for the bayonet. When I lay on the floor, one of the sergeants knelt on my back. The other 2 placed 1 foot each on my back and left shoulder, and the man who knelt on me twisted my right arm, holding it by the wrist with one hand, while he held my hair with the other to pull my head back. The arm was twisted from the elbow joint. This continued to the best of my judgment for 5 minutes. It was very painful. During the twisting of my arm, the first officer continued to question me as to the names and addresses of my companions, and also asked me the name of my company commander and any other officers I knew. As I still persisted in refusing to answer these questions, I was allowed to get up and I was handcuffed again. I could certainly identify the officer who directed proceedings and put the questions. I am not sure of the others, except the sergeant with the bayonet. My arm was medically treated by an officer of the Royal Army Medical Corps the following morning, and by the prison hospital orderly for the next 4 or 5 days. On his arrest, Kevin had given his address as 58 South Circular Road, the home of his uncle Patrick Dowling, where he had spent the previous few nights for fear that the family home on Fleet Street would be raided. Within a few hours of his arrest, his uncle's house was ransacked by the army, and anything belonging to Kevin was confiscated. Kevin was soon removed from the North Dublin Union and would spend the next 6 weeks in Mountjoy prison, where he was kept under constant guard by members of the auxiliary police force, and his arm would remain in a sling for weeks. He was visited frequently in Mountjoy by his uncle Patrick and friends. His close family members had been advised by the IRA not to visit him, as they hoped that the authorities would not realise just how involved he had been in volunteer activities and may give him a custodial sentence. His mother Mary found herself unable to stay away and visited her son several times in disguise. Kathy would not get to see him until a month after his arrest. Soon the devastating news was announced that Kevin Barry was to be tried by court-martial for the murder of Private Matthew Whitehead, a crime that under a new Restoration of Order Act was to be punishable by hanging. A date was set for the court-martial on the 20th of October 1920 in Marlborough Barracks, a short distance from Mountjoy Prison, and the authorities were hard at work gathering evidence and witnesses to support their case. Kevin soon decided that he would not recognise the court and thereby would have no defence during the trial. However, General Headquarters of the IRA informed Kathy Barry that they had assigned solicitor Eamon Duggan to prepare a defence on his behalf. This caused a lot of distress for Kathy, as she and the family wanted to honour Kevin's wishes. Eventually, Tim Healy took over the job of preparing his defence, and on assessing the evidence, he initially felt that Kevin's only hope was a plea of insanity. This was immediately dismissed by Kathy, as she knew without doubt that Kevin would never approve of this, and finally he agreed that his best option was to not recognise the court, much to Kathy's relief, and they were hopeful that an English court would not execute an 18-year-old who refused to defend himself. What little hope the family and friends of Kevin Barry did have was misplaced, as the desire to have him executed came from the very top. Both Prime Minister Lloyd George and General Macready, Commander-in-Chief of British forces in Ireland, were eager for the hangings to begin, to act as a deterrent to those who dared to rebel against the British Empire. Macready, who famously despised Ireland, once said, "I loathe the country and its people with a depth deeper than the sea and more violent than that which I feel against the Germans." He wished to instill confidence in police forces who were at the time carrying out their own violent reprisals across the country. At 10 AM on Wednesday the 20th of October 1920, a makeshift courtroom in Marlborough Barracks filled with people including Mary and Kathleen Barry, Patrick Dowling and many friends to witness the court-martial of Kevin Barry. They waited anxiously for the accused to appear in court, but his arrival was delayed as the prison transport van had broken down on North Circular Road with Kevin inside, much to his amusement, and they had to wait for a replacement to arrive. When the brief trial began, Kevin stuck to his guns and refused to engage with the court, and no defence was to be offered. He proudly informed the slew of officers before him, "As a soldier of the Irish Republic, I refuse to recognise this court." The court-martial gave a detailed account of the events on Church Street that day, of the weapon and ammunition used by Kevin, and how, they alleged, it had matched the bullet that had killed Private Whitehead. 16 witnesses gave evidence at the trial, and after each was finished, Kevin was asked by the president of the court if he had any questions, to which he replied no. The repeated questions soon angered him, and he stated, "Look, I have told you, I don't recognise the court. I have no interest in what anybody says here. You are only wasting your time asking me." The prosecution alleged that the bullet that had killed Private Whitehead was of the same type used by the Mauser found in the possession of Kevin Barry, thus making him guilty of his murder. The fact that the bullet had not actually been found in his body, but rather on a bloody operating table that was used to treat other patients, was irrelevant to the prosecution and the court. The day came to an end shortly after lunch, with the court-martial convinced of Kevin's guilt. However, his sentencing would have to wait, and he was returned to Mountjoy by armoured car. The following morning, Kate Kinsella made her way to the gates of the prison to deliver a homemade breakfast for Kevin. His meals in the prison had so far been supplied by a nearby restaurant, but he had longed to taste Kate's cooking again. When she arrived at the prison, the warders refused to take the meal from her, and on returning to Fleet Street, she burst into tears. Kathy visited him later that day for the first time now that no real hope remained. On her arrival, Kevin informed her that his sentence had been passed the evening before. At 8 p.m, Captain Wilson, a British officer whom Kevin had befriended in prison, had entered his cell and handed him a note before bursting into tears. He was to be hanged on the 1st of November, and, on Kevin's own orders, there were to be no appeals. When, a week later, the method of execution was once again confirmed, Kevin told Kathy, "I suppose they told you they are not going to let me fall like a soldier, but at least they will hang me like a gentleman." With the confirmation of his execution, Kevin's fate began to be covered in the newspapers that had, up until that point, concentrated on the hunger strike and death on the 25th of October of the Lord Mayor of Cork, Terence McSweeney, in Brixton Prison. There was some hope that a last-minute reprieve may come on account of his age, but this was not to be the case. The authorities had no sympathy for Kevin's youth, as the 3 soldiers who had died in the ambush were of a similar age or younger. Erskine Childers wrote in a letter published in the Westminster Gazette, "This lad Barry was doing precisely what an Englishman would be doing in the same circumstances and with the same bitter and intolerable provocation, the suppression by military force of their country's liberty. To hang him for murder is an insulting outrage, and it is more, it is an abuse of power, an unworthy act of vengeance, contrasting with the forbearance and humanity invariably shown by the Irish volunteers towards the prisoners captured by them when they have been successful in encounters similar to this one. To hang Barry is to push to its logical extreme the hypocritical pretense that the national movement in Ireland, unflinchingly supported by the great mass of the Irish people, is the squalid conspiracy of a murder gang. That is false. It is a natural uprising, a collision between 2 governments, one resting on consent, the other on force. The Irish are struggling against overwhelming odds to defend their elected institutions against extinction. Appeals were made in both Ireland and abroad by politicians and senior religious figures for mercy, but the British government refused all calls for a reprieve. Several plans were made by the IRA to rescue Kevin, one of which involved blowing a hole in the wall of the prison, climbing in through the rubble, and finding Kevin in prison before making their escape. But when they learned that the auxiliaries who guarded him had been ordered to shoot him on the spot should any rescue attempt take place, this plan was deemed not to be feasible. Other plans involved infiltrating the prison and overpowering the auxiliary guards, and then shooting their way out of the prison. All of these plans were called off at the last minute, due to the danger of civilians being killed in the crossfire. On his return to Mountjoy, Kevin Barry was placed in the cell of the condemned man, located next to the hanging chamber, where he would spend the last days of his life. By all accounts, he remained in high spirits during his final week. The auxiliaries and police warders were very fond of him, and according to the Barry family, treated him with kindness during his stay. One of the auxiliaries had even assisted him in writing the affidavit that outlined the abuse he had suffered during interrogation. He was allowed more visitors than the average condemned man due to his good relationship with his captors, and was kept quite busy writing letters to thank those who had come in to see him. As the 1st of November approached, Kevin's family members visited him for the final time, surrounded by soldiers, prison warders, and auxiliaries in the prison boardroom. Kevin smiled reassuringly and began to sing, trying to put his mother, brother, and sister at ease. For quite some time now, he had taken some comfort in the knowledge that his death would not be in vain, and may help to bring about the republic he had been fighting for. When the meeting came to an end, he bid a final farewell to his family and asked Kathy to give my love to the boys in the company. Later that evening, he wrote a letter to Kathy in which he said, "I had quite a busy day. I had a visit from a most effusive young lady whom I didn't know from Adam. She knew all about me, however. She wept, but she meant well. Then I had 2 sisters of charity, then 3 more visits, then the chaplain followed by Father Albert. I then interviewed 2 Bon Secours sisters and finished up with the chaplain. The boys from the college were up outside the gate and they said the rosary. They also sang the soldier's song, which did me more good than you can imagine. Everybody has been very decent. Now, I'll shut up. I wish you every success in love and business. Give my adieu to Des and your mother, and say a little prayer for me when I cash in. Your pal, Kevin." Before first light, on Monday the 1st of November 1920, crowds of supporters began to gather outside the walls of Mountjoy Prison on North Circular Road. The scene was described as follows in the Evening Herald. The air was chill and damp, but the devoted people knelt and prayed, the rosary being recited at intervals. Night workers, pale and haggard, joined in the demonstration of love and sorrow. By 7 o'clock, there were fully 2,000 people gathered. It was a silent, patient, but intensely moved throng. Scarcely a word was spoken in the interval of the prayers, but now and then the silence was broken by the sobs of women. As the morning wore on, the crowd thickened until there was a dense mass extending 100 yards along North Circular Road. Momentary confusion was created amongst the mourners, many of whom were on their knees, by the arrival of an armoured car which drove through and took up a position close to the police station. The guns from the turrets were turned on the crowd, who maintained an unmoved demeanour. A contingent of Cumann men marching towards the prison came in for special attention, but they ignored the menace of the guns. Some of the soldiers whistled in derision, but stopped almost immediately, evidently impressed by the display. Inside the cell of the condemned man, Kevin Barry also knelt and prayed, with his rosary bead in his hands, as he had done for much of the night. At 7 a.m, Canon Waters and Father McMahon entered the cell and were greeted with a smile. Kevin gave his final confession and received communion, and then Canon Waters celebrated Mass, joined by the prison guards and the auxiliaries. It was dark at the time, and the cell was lit only by candles. The most cheerful and unmoved of those present was the condemned boy. The executioners, both of whom spoke with English accents, then entered the cell, and one of them inquired of Canon Waters, "Are you quite done, Father?" It was intimated that the Mass was concluded, and then the 2 executioners proceeded to pinion the boy, who submitted quietly and actually assisted them in the operation. The death bell of Mountjoy began to toll, and those who gathered on the street outside knew that the final moment had come. The awful procession to the execution chamber then formed. In front went one of the executioners, followed by the doomed youth, with whom were the 2 chaplains. Behind these came the second executioner and the prison warders. Barry never for one moment flinched or wavered. His young neck was bared, his head bent forward humbly as he responded to the litany for the dying. The two clergymen stood beside him as the process of pinioning the limbs took place on the scaffold. The white cap was rapidly drawn over the face, and in less than half a minute, all was over. Father McMahon descended into the pit and anointed the still warm body. Outside the prison walls, there were audible sobs from men, and tears streamed down the faces of women. All knew that the tolling of the bell indicated the departure of the brave boy from the condemned cell to the place of execution. A few moments later, Canon Waters appeared at the prison gate and was surrounded by the crowd. Crying and shaking, he conveyed his grim message. It is all over. Canon Waters later told a reporter that, "I never met a braver man. He died a most holy death, and his bravery took most of the horror out of the scene. He died with prayers for everybody, for his people, his country, himself, and his enemies." The request of the Barry family to have the body returned was denied, and a few hours after his death, a small plot of land was blessed and consecrated by Canon Waters and Father McMahon, and Kevin Barry was buried within the walls of Mountjoy prison. Within the space of a year, he would be joined in his resting place by 9 other volunteers, including his friend Frank Flood, who had also taken part in the Church Street raid. They too were hanged in the prison, and there they would remain until 2001, becoming known as the Forgotten 10. 80 years after their deaths, Kevin Barry, Patrick Moran, Frank Flood, Thomas Whelan, Thomas Traynor, Patrick Doyle, Edmund Foley, Thomas Bryan, Bernard Ryan, and Patrick Marr were given a full state funeral and reinterred in Glasnevin Cemetery. Kevin Barry was finally laid to rest a short distance from the grave of his sister, Kathy Barry Maloney, who died in 1969. The hanging of Kevin Barry on All Saints' Day 1920 was intended to be a stark warning from the British government to anybody who dared to take up arms and fight for the Republican cause. However, the callous execution of such a young man as a common criminal rather than the soldier that he was enraged and horrified people in Ireland and across the world, and created a perfect martyr for the cause of Irish liberation. And to this day, the portrait of Kevin Barry in his school jersey is one of the most striking and poignant images of the revolutionary period. Number 8 Fleet Street remained in the Barry family for many years until it finally fell into a state of disrepair and was demolished by Dublin Corporation. In 2021, a life-size statue of Kevin Barry was unveiled in the village of Rathvilly, where he attended primary school, just a few miles from the Barry home in Tombay.